My name is Pamela Scott. I do want to point out new Historical Society bookmarks with our website information. If you missed any of the other programs, many of them have been taped and are on our website. You can watch them from the comfort of your home when it's 30 degrees. And so please take a bookmark. Also, there's a
Hello, and thank you all for being here today. As Pam said, my name is Zachary Garceau, and I am the archivist at the Historical Society, and I have always had an interest in sports and history. When I received my master's degree, I did a thesis. It was on Johnny Unitas and the Cold War, and I've just always been fascinated with sports history, so this seemed like a natural choice for me. And so today I really just want to talk to you a little bit about the history of basketball at Westerly High School. So just to get started, I want to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're looking at with some facts and figures. So for the boys teams, and also I'm going to be separating them between the boys and the girls teams. We'll be talking about both, but they were two very separate entities, so it's important to talk about them both individually. So Westerly, the boys teams, are tied for the third most state titles in Rhode Island with 7. And between the years of 1931 and 1966, the teams had 570 wins to just 225 losses. And during that span, they were winning 71.7, so about 7 out of 10 of all of their games they were playing, they were winning, and they were winning almost 17 games per season. And as of 2016, there are 14 boys who have individually scored over 1,000 points in their career at Westerly. And most recently, between 2010 and 2018, the teams have actually gone 97 and 45 in division. So they've been playing very well over the last 8 years, and things have definitely been looking up. So there's a lot to look forward to going forward. But now just a little bit about the girls team. So between 1980 and 1989, they had a record of 113 and 75, and since 2000, they have had a record of 217 to 120. So they've also been playing very well since the year 2000. So they've also won 2 state championships, and they've been runner-up for the division title twice. And they've also had 10 seasons where they've won 15 or more games since 1974. And the 1974, so 1973 is actually going to be an important year, something I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but There were very early girls teams at Westerly, but there was a long period where they didn't have a team that played against other schools, and 1973 is actually, 73-74 was the first season in which the girls team was reintroduced. So that's where we're really having the baseline for that number. And yes?
I do want you to ask the audience,
Mm-hmm.
is there anyone who played girls basketball in the audience for Westerly High School?
That's a great question. Ellen, yes? Yeah.
Intramural.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Like Stonington,
Oh, okay. So I didn't realize that they played Stonington. Okay. So they did play other schools. It was just not a full schedule, I guess.
There you go.
Okay. Excellent. Did not realize that, so thank you for asking that. And as of 2015, there are 4 girls who have scored over 1,000 points in their career at Westerly. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the places that the teams have played. Earlier on, in 1900 to 1902, they played at what was called the Hall of Company B, which is also the Pawcatuck Armory. In 1900, they played a game in what was called the Hall on Main Street. Unfortunately, there wasn't really any more information given on that, so we can't be sure. Also, in 1908, there were some games that were played at the Ancient Order of Hibernians Hall, which is now the synagogue that's on Union Street. In the 1920s, they played at Champlain Hall, which was on Main Street. That may have been downtown in the Champlain block. Oh.
Just speak up a little bit. No, not for the video, but...
Oh, yes, sorry about that. Can definitely be louder. I can try to. And then starting in 1931, they played at Babcock Junior High School. And that's actually when they started getting the full backing of the school, because until then, as you can tell, the locations were relatively sporadic all over town. But once they built the junior high school, which had a gym, they were actually able to play their games in a consistent place and to actually host other schools on a regular basis. And then the current Westerly High School opened in 1937. And originally they played in what is now the fitness center at the high school, and then eventually they moved into the current gym. So, and actually just wanted to point out some of the different uniforms that the boys wore early on here. So, as you can tell, there were definitely times when sometimes they had the word Westerly on their jerseys, other times they just went with the numbers, and in the 1950s they actually wore the short sleeve jerseys, which stuck around for a little while. So in the earliest one that we have an image of right now is the 1931 team. And then later on you can also see there's some more changes that they went through. And it wasn't until the 90s that they actually had Bulldogs written on there for a while. And all the way, oh, sorry about that. And all the way on the end is the current jerseys that they're wearing. And now for the girls, they were a little bit different. In the 70s, they actually had the Bulldog image on there, and they did the short sleeve for a while as well, and you can also see the most current ones there. So there's a couple different shades of blue they went through, but that's also another thing, is that despite the fact that the photos are in black and white, because they were largely taken from the yearbooks and newspapers, which only publish them in black and white, it's a little bit hard to tell, but they've always, the colors of Westerly have always been blue and white. So like I said, despite the lack of color in the images, that's the colors they've always worn. And as I mentioned, we have all of the state championships that the teams have won. And one thing that I found particularly astounding is that between 1939 and 1960, Westerly, the boys teams, were in the finals 12 times. So out of 21 years, they were in the state finals 12, so more than half the times during that. So that really should give you an idea of just how good they were during that period. And as I mentioned, there were 2 girls' championship teams as well. And now, just a little bit of background on how the boys' team got started. And as we were mentioning, that's the 31-32 team, and that was the one that first played at the junior high school. And prior to 1931, the records for boys' teams are relatively sparse, and we don't know a whole lot about them because, again, they played seasons where they would play relatively few games because they didn't have a place to play. without a permanent home court, it made it difficult for them to schedule other teams. So once they opened the junior high in 1931, they really were able to start hosting a full schedule. The first season where there's really any solid documentation was in 1924 and 25. That team actually only played 6 games that we have a record of. And the earliest mention I could find of an established team that was playing other schools was in 1919, but there's really not much that we know about that team. And in 1900, a lot further back, there was a team for each class at Westerly, but it appears that they only played amongst themselves, so there were, like the seniors would play the freshmen or the sophomores, so it was really only within the school itself at that point. And then, as I mentioned, 1931 was the first year they had that full support. And now the girls' teams, actually, very early on, there were more solid records prior to 1910. We know that the first game that the Westerly girls' teams played was December 20th, 1900. And during that game, they beat Hopkinton High School by a score of 10-7. And it was actually 4 minutes into the game before the first basket was even scored, and that was on a free throw. And at the end of the first half, the score was 5-1. So it wasn't a baseball score, that was actually basketball. Had to do a double take, but 10-7 was the final. And the 1900 to 1901 season, they had a record of 2-1. They had 1 win and a loss against Hopkinton, and they had a win over South Kingstown. And the following season, in 01-02, they had a record of 3-1. And in 1908, and that was the games that were played at the Ancient Order of Hibernians Hall, there was a game that was played between the junior and senior classes for a trophy cup, and the seniors won that by a score of 13-10. And here we actually have a picture of the 1901-1902 girls team. So as you can tell, they didn't have defined uniforms at that time like they did later on, although this may not have been in the uniforms that they were wearing to play, but that is the picture that they have for the 1902 team. And now from 1910 to 1930 is really when things started to get rolling on that, and the interest in basketball really started to get built up before that 31 season. So the earliest reference to a team, which was we found was located on March 24th, 1919, and that was when a Westerly High School team lost to a team called the Stonington Regulars by a score of 33-21. We don't really know much about the Stonington Regulars. I found a few baseball teams that use that name, but very little is actually documented about that game or that team in particular. So the 1922-23 season was interesting in the fact that it never really got going. They played 1 game and they lost to South Kingstown, and then before they could play another game, the season was canceled, and because they had failed to secure the Armory to play their games, and they had nowhere to schedule opponents, so they had to cancel it after just 1 game. And then in 1924-25, they had 3 wins and 3 losses, and that team was described as not a financial success. So if that's the only thing that you can say about the team, that can tell you a little bit about how that went. And then in 1925 and 26, they had 3 wins to 4 losses, but they beat Stonington twice and South Kingstown once. And those teams were the ones that played at Champlin's Hall, which was described as not large enough for real basketball. So again, you can tell they weren't really happy with the accommodations, but it was all that they had available to them at that point. So the girls' teams in 24 and 25 only played 2 games, both of which were losses, and they also had to end their season due to not having a home court. So it was really difficult for these teams early on to get any momentum and really get support when it wasn't even a sure thing that they were going to be playing any more games than they were. And there, after 1925, there was no real record of any girls' teams playing other schools on a full schedule until 1973, and girls' high school basketball was unregulated and largely underfunded until the passing of Title IX in 1972, and Title IX mandated that no person should be excluded from participating in educational programs or activities on the basis of sex, and as a result, girls' teams were established at Westerly to offer them similar opportunities to those that were afforded to the boys. And here we actually just have a couple more photos from the girls' teams. So on the side we have Jean D. Gourlay, who was the forward on the 1902 team. And then we have a photo that's a girls' team that was representing the class of 1925. And I believe that was one of the teams that played amongst others in the school. So that was the class of 1925 team. They would have played the class of 24, 26 in the school. So 1930s are really when the official history of the boys' team and a solid foundation where we can really trace the origins of that team was in the 1930s. And as the decade got started in 1930, there was only interclass basketball until December 1st, 1931, when Coach Stan Martowski held tryouts and 50 boys showed up. So they actually had a really good turnout and a lot of interest for the team at that point, which, although they had a lot of interest, between 1931 and 33, the team went a dismal 3-21, so they had a lot of difficulty early on. And during that 31-32 season, they were scoring an average of 13.9 points, but they were giving up 31.7. So when you look at that and you realize that they were giving up almost 20 more than they were scoring, I kind of wonder how they even won 3 games, but there must have been someone worse than them. So until 1935 and 36, they actually played in the Eastern Connecticut Conference despite being in Rhode Island. And then after that point, they moved over to the newly formed Rhode Island Interscholastic League. And on December 24th, 1939, so on Christmas Eve no less, Westerly defeated Stonington by, and that is not a typo, 158-12. So that was Stonington's first season resuming play in basketball, and it seems to have showed. In a 32-minute game, Westerly scored nearly 5 points per minute, which was unheard of in any time, but especially in the 1930s. And George Mearns scored 62 points in that game. And Westerly ended the 1930s with a 20-3 season, which was good for first place in their division. So from the very beginnings in the 31, 32, 33 season, where things really weren't going well, it definitely started to turn around by the end of the 1930s. And Leo Smith coached the team from 1933 until 1937, and then he was followed by Jim Federico, who is the namesake of the high school's current gym, who really coached the school through its most successful periods in the 40s and 50s, and we'll be seeing a lot more of him coming up. So here is the 1937-38 boys teams, and that is Coach Federico is there on the end. And so then the 1940s was when the dynasty really started to get going. The 1940-41 season, Westerly was set to play Pawtucket West for the state championship, and because Westerly had already played 2 playoff series previously for a total of 6 games, they had asked that the state championship game be changed to a winner-take-all, but Pawtucket West declined, and they were awarded the title because Westerly had requested that and was declined for that. So despite making it to the state championship, you know, I was a little unclear on that as well, because I don't really understand how by, yes, yes.
So what happened was, Wesley played what was considered to be a suicide schedule, playing way too many games in a short period of time. And the principal, Mr. Mason, Charles Mason, he was not going to accept another series of 3 games against Pawtucket West. So as you say, he petitioned the Principals Association for just a 1-game playoff, and Pawtucket West didn't want to go for that either. And therefore, the state finals never actually happened. Pawtucket West was the champion.
Thank you so much. And in case anyone isn't familiar, that is Bob Marr, who wrote the book The Swish Kids, which was invaluable in my research. So thank you so much for contributing that. And Thank you for all your research, because it was really helpful in this. So, now, the 1942 season is what's considered the lost season, because in 1942-43, Westerly is found to have used an ineligible player by the name of Siegel Rawls, who was the team's #2 scorer. It was found out that Rawls was actually 20 years old during the season, which was a violation of state rules at the time. So Westerly was forced to forfeit all but 3 of their games, and their season record went from a fantastic 18-1 to a not so fantastic 2-17. The way that this happened was when Rawls gave his date of birth when he enrolled in school, he said he was born in October of 1922, but when he went to go register for the draft for World War II, his father obtained his birth certificate from Virginia, and he found out he was actually born in 1921. And this was reported, and unfortunately, Westerly had to forfeit those games. And this was actually a pretty big story, because a lot of the headlines I have here came from newspapers that were across the country. I found it was in Michigan, New Jersey. This story actually made the rounds. So that was a pretty big story for that day. And the 1940s, after that season, things definitely improved. They came back from the 1942 season with a season of 17-1, and they lost the Class B title game to St. Raphael. And then they made it to back-to-back title games in 43-44 and then in 44-45, but they lost both of those games by a total of 3 points. So they were getting really close, but it just wasn't happening yet, but they're getting there. And so in the 42-43 season, the team had, when they came into that season, they had won 86 consecutive regular season games, and that streak was broken when they lost to Central Falls by 2 points when they lost 47-45 in February of 1947. So it was over 4 years before they had lost a regular season game, which is incredibly impressive in any stretch of the imagination. And so they finally reached the pinnacle in the 47-48 season when they won the first of their back-to-back titles that year. And Walt Negrelli was the leading scorer for the team in the second half of the 1940s, and he was scoring 22.5 points per game as a senior that year. And actually, that is him right there, making a basket for them. And the 1950s are what I consider the golden age. So Westerly initially played in Class B, but after they went 119 wins to just 5 losses between 1943 and 51, the Rhode Island Interscholastic League looked at those numbers and realized that they probably should move Westerly up, and they did, and Westerly was promoted to Class A at that point. The team started the 1950s by going 21-1 and winning the state championship during the 50-51 season. So that one loss for that year was to Bulkley of High School of New London, and that was in the New England tournament. And so the team actually had 4 players average more than 10 points a game, which was a new record. Prior to that, they had never had more than 3 players who scored at least 10 points per game. In 1951 and 52, we had what was probably the greatest single season for one player in Westerly history, based purely on the numbers, when Bobby Serra averaged an astounding 30.1 points per game, and he scored in double figures in every single game he played that season. And that season, the team was scoring 76 points per game while giving up only 54. And between 1951 and 1960, they won 5 of their state championships. And here we actually just have some images. So in here we have Rudy Federico, who's blocking a shot in the 1951 New England Championship that I just mentioned, and that was actually held at Boston Garden. And then we have Ron Stenhouse, who was the captain of the 57-58 team. And he actually went on to play basketball at URI, as many Westerly players at the time did, or at least there were several who ended up playing for URI. So now in the 1950s, yes, I was going to say John Stelliano, who has joined us here today, replaced a retiring Jim Federico as coach for the 54-55 season. In 1955-56, Westerly won the state championship and made it all the way to the finals of the New England tournament, which were played at Boston Garden, and Westerly fell 53-44 to Durfee High School from Fall River. And the team wasn't exactly popular everywhere. After winning a February 1953 game at Pawtucket West, which they won by 40 points, the team's bus was surrounded by a group of angry girls from Pawtucket who hurled rocks at the bus. So despite the fact that they were winning a lot, not everybody was happy about it. And now the 1957-58 state championship was one of the more memorable games in recent history for them because they won the state championship on a last-minute shot by sophomore Roger Hamilton. And you can see the headline that appeared in the Westerly Sun right after that game. And so that was, a really great victory for the team, and that was one of the ones that always stands out for a lot of people. And the 1960s are sometimes considered the end of an era because it was kind of the start of a turn downward for the team. In 1960, Chariho Regional High School opened, and prior to that, students from Charlestown, Richmond, and Hopkinton all attended Westerly High School, and because they no longer were getting players that were coming from those towns, that represented a bit of a loss for the team. So they lost out on some of the talent pool that ended up playing for Chariho. And the 1962-63 team went 9-10, and this was the first team to not go to the state championship tournament since 1942. So there's a span of 20 years where they made the state championship tournament every single year. So that was the first time that didn't happen in quite a while. And the team really began to show signs of a downturn right around then, and they had a record of 44-39, which is still a winning record, but compared to the numbers they were putting up before that, this represented a bit of a turn downward for them. And then John Stelliano resigned from the school system in 1966 to accept another job, and he was replaced by Jim Federico, who coached one final season at Westerly. And Federico brought that magic one last time and led Westerly to a state championship in 1966-67. And then the 68-69 team once again made it to the Class B championship game, which they lost to West Warwick. And that was our last championship appearance until 2001. And here yes. So here we have few pictures, which it seems like some here might be familiar with some of these. And I, just going through some of the old yearbooks, I love that picture that's on the left. Thought that was great. And then we have Mark O'Donnell, who was the co-captain in 1968-69, putting up a shot right there. And as you can tell, that was what is now the current fitness center in Westerly, because that's not the Federico gym. And so the 1970s for the boys were a bit of a down decade, you could say. So James Jerry Gleason, who's the former coach of De La Salle in Newport, was named the coach of Westerly in 1973, and Coach Gleason is also here with us today. So yes, he came on in 1973, and the team's highest finish in their division during the decade was third place, where they finished 3 times. And during the 76-77 season, the team finished with a record of 15-7, which was one of the highlights of the decade. And now, coming back to the girls' teams in the 1970s, which I'm calling a new beginning because it really was for those teams which hadn't played against other schools it was the first team to compete against other schools in nearly 50 years in 1973. The 1974-75 team had a great showing when they went 11-5, and they were averaging 62 points per game while giving up only 41. So they were winning by quite a bit. And even in the team's 5 losses, they were only by an average of 4.4 points. So even the losses, they were playing really well, and they were playing very close games. The 75-76 season was up and down in the fact that although they finished 8-5, which is certainly a winning record and a very respectable one, it was interesting that the 5 of their wins were by 51, 48, 47, 46, and 31. So they weren't close games. So looking at numbers like that, it's just surprising that they even had 5 losses. So it was an up and down year for them, but a very good one nonetheless. And the 1980s, the boys team struggled significantly throughout that decade, and they had 7 seasons which they had at least 10 losses. And the 1988-89 season, though, they went 20-5, but they still finished 3rd place in their division despite winning 20 games. On the other hand, the girls teams in the 89-90 team, they won the Division II state championship when they defeated East Greenwich by a score of 50-46. And between 1980 and 1990, the team had 4 seasons in which they won at least 15 or more games in their league. And here we have a picture of the 88-89 girls team, and then a picture of Adam Bozek from 1985. And there you can tell they had moved into Federico Gym by that point. And now the 1990s, so the boys teams continued to struggle throughout the 1990s. There were some highlights to be sure, but they lost 15 games in the 93-94 season, and they finished in 9th place that year. They improved somewhat the following season, going 8-8 in league games, but they still finished in 5th place. But in the 97-98 season, they went 16-9, and they defeated Coventry in the playoffs before they fell to South Kingstown that year. And for the girls, however, in 91-92, they went 12-2 in their league games, and they went all the way to the Division II championship game, but they fell to Portsmouth by a score of 50-45. And then in 1995, Bethany Roy set the school career scoring record, and she had scored 1,133 points in her Westerly career, and she was elected to the high school's Hall of Fame in 2010. And here we just have some pictures from the 1990s. The one on the left is from 1995. And then we have Dave Federico, who's going up for a rebound, and that was in 1991. Oh, a little too far, there we go. And now, so since 2000 up until the current day, there's definitely been some new heights that they've reached. The boys teams from 2000 to 2010 still continued to struggle a little bit. They finished better than 4th place only one time, and that was in 2002-2003 when they went 20-7, but they finished in 1st place that year. Despite going 19-7 overall in 2008-2009, the team finished 5th in their division that year, but between 2011 and it should actually be 2018, because the 2019 season is not over yet, and the boys team is actually going to be in the playoffs this year, so you know that will be rewritten at some point. The teams have gone 97-45 in division games, and in 2015-16 the team was the runners-up in all of Division II. Now, the girls' teams between 2000 and 2010 never finished lower than 3rd place in their division, so they were consistently very good teams. And between 2006 and 2008, they went 40-12, so they were very good during those years. And 2009-2010, the team won the Division II championship by beating Cheraho 46-43. The following season, they actually made it back to the state championship game, but fell to LaSalle 55-48. And the 16-17 team actually finished in 1st place, but they lost in overtime in the semifinals of those Division II playoffs. So since 2000, the teams have been very good, so it's very encouraging going forward, and there's a lot to look forward to for these teams. And here we have a picture of the girls' teams from 2010. And as you can tell, those games are actually played at the Ryan Center at URI. And then we have Brian Ravenel, who scored over 1,000 points, and he was the school's all-time leader in three-pointers made when he graduated in 2002. And that is the end. And then these are just some of the various Bulldog logos that have showed up over time that's been used by Westerly. And
are there any of the men players in the audience? Any of those people that played for the
Yes.
men's team?
Also a great question. Do we have anyone who has played for the boys' teams here? Just one? Two? Yes. I can fully admit I can write about them and do the research. I did not play. I probably would not have been good enough for it, but you know, I'm glad that we have a lot of players out here today. And are there any questions anyone has? Yes, sir?
Yeah, just, is Coach Stellano, not Stelliano?
Okay. I'm sorry. You know, I heard someone say that and I realized I misread it, and then after misreading it once, yes, I am so sorry, sir. I misread the name once, and then, you know, it's one of those things where as soon as you start writing it one way, you just kind of keep doing it. And as soon as I heard someone say it, I was like, oh, I think I got that wrong, but it's too late to change it. But I'm sorry about that. Thank you for that, sir. Yes? As soon as I said it, I was like, oh, I think that might have not have been right. Yes. So I don't know a great deal about it. I do know that, so it was James Naismith. So he was, I believe he was working at the YMCA in Springfield, which is why the Basketball Hall of Fame is there. I don't know. The very few things I do know about it is that they initially played it with peach baskets, and and there were a lot of rules that were different at the time. They didn't have a three-point line, and there was no shot clock, which is why we got games that ended up 10-7, because people would just kind of hold on to the ball until they thought they could make a shot. So that's how we got that. But I'm not entirely sure too much about the earlier history, and I know that it was, I believe, in the 1890s, so it didn't take too long if they had teams by 1900 that were playing here to make its way down here. But yeah, no, I'm not too familiar with the entire history of it. Unfortunately, it's not too much I know. I just, like I said, by 1900 they were playing it here, and there was some interest in it at least, which was a problem at certain times, because I remember reading quite a bit in one of the resources I used a lot was The Senior, which was the high school's newspaper at the time, or they put out the newsletter. And they often, especially in the 1910s, put out a lot of articles that say, well, you know, there could be enough interest for a basketball team, you know, maybe if people cared more about it. There was a lot of things where it's like, there might be interest, but they had a hard time really getting people to care. But by the 1930s, they certainly did, because by 31, they had 50 boys showing up for tryouts. So there was definitely interest by the time the junior high was built. So, and yes?
One of the things you didn't mention was 1952, I was playing basketball, and we had the Army-Navy teams. Did you do any research on that?
I found a little bit about that, and
we didn't play other schools.
Okay.
But we played within.
Yes, and actually, if you could tell me a little bit more about that, because I am interested, because I did see those. Okay.
And it was the Army team.
Okay.
And I have a cousin through marriage that actually said, no, I was on a Navy team. I said, no, I was on a Navy team. So we went to the yearbook. We found we were both on the same team, and I never knew it. I don't have a lot on that.
Oh, but yeah, I saw the pictures in the yearbooks. There really wasn't any information that they wrote about. They included some pictures, but because I didn't know much about it, and also because it seemed that they played within the school itself, I was really trying to focus more on playing other schools. But because I didn't have a lot on it, I unfortunately wasn't able to get that in there. But I appreciate that, so thank you for filling this in. Yeah. Yeah. Ellen?
Do you know when the women's team went from half court to full court in high school play? I don't.
I don't either, actually.
The end was 1950 something.
Okay.
No,
I did not know that. Okay. Yes, Brenda.
I used about the time on West Africa, and that was 57, so, but it was shortly after.
Yes, Brenda?
I played, when I was in high school, I played, the court was 3-on-3, guards on one side,
Oh,
forwards
okay.
on the other side. Sometime in high school, they had what we called rovers,
Yeah.
in which 2 girls from each team could go back and forth, but 2 guards and 2 forwards had to stay.
Okay.
When I played in college, we went from 6 to 5, and I was in college in the late 60s. We went from 6 to 5, and everybody ran.
Okay.
So it was the late 60s when we women played
Okay.
the court.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing much about that, but I actually,
67.
I feel like I had heard about that before, so that's interesting. But, yes, Bob?
You can go to YouTube and search for like Iowa State Championship,
Mhm.
1957, something like that, and they'll have the actual state championship games,
Hmm.
6. It's quite fascinating. It's actually a lot better than you think it would be.
Yeah.
Because what happens is when a ball goes through the basket at one end, the referee immediately throws it to half court to another referee. The girl is ready there to inbound it from half court. They play another little 3-on-3 session.
Oh.
And so then
I hadn't
the
thought,
ball's
yeah.
doesn't go in the basket,
Hmm.
they'll dribble out to half court if they want to, but they have to throw the ball before they can't cross half court.
Oh.
But it's much more exciting
Yeah.
than you might think. And,
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about the implications of having to get the ball to the half court, so that is really interesting. Huh.
Was it a mistake? Was it a mistake for women to go to full court then? do you
well, the
think?
only reason I think it might have been a mistake was that when you play 3-on-3, you really have to learn the game. You have to learn to play with each other and set picks and come off picks and stuff like that. And sometimes 5-on-5 for girls can be a little, at least I found in the beginning, could be a little difficult because it was all congested. So half court was much more congested with 10 players than 6. So in some ways, I think it was a little bit regressive for like the really younger players. But the problem was some girls are only getting to play defense. Some girls are getting to play offense. It was really interesting and
Yeah.
exciting.
I hadn't heard of that. That does sound really interesting.
Oh, yes. Oh,
Yeah.
I have a great story.
Oh.
I was the high scorer on my team
Oh, yes.
in high school.
Uh-huh.
We, in one particular game, we lost 89. I scored the 2.
So you scored more than half their points, so yeah. That's still impressive. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
If I could just add, if you were to go on there and check them out, I mean, they pack big places in the
Yeah.
Midwest, in Indiana, Iowa, and all those places. It's a big
Yeah.
event.
Oh, yeah, especially in Indiana. That's, yeah.
And it was very, very exciting. So you sort of get
Yeah.
this impression that it must have been kind of boring, but it was nothing anywhere near boring.
Yeah.
I played guard, and that was because I have a depth perception problem. So for me to throw it in the basket was a real challenge, and so therefore it was a real advantage to be a guard for me.
Well, I have a fun story too,
Yeah.
as long as we're going fun stories. We had our Army-Navy game, and I didn't get along too well with the gym teacher,
Mhm.
so she didn't put me in. So we had a tie score, and she put me in for the last second. And I scored 2 baskets. And so we won the game,
Mhm.
and Bobby Sarah,
Mhm.
he was playing at that time. The guys all came down and carried me off the floor. Never forget that. And I only weighed like 99 pounds, and they had teacher heck, why didn't you put her in before? So it's just a fun story.
Did you start the next game?
What did
Did you start the next
Oh,
game?
yeah.
Showed up.
Mhm. And any other questions, or? All right. Oh.
The Honors did one game,
Mhm.
and I'm assuming the Westerly Honors.
Yes. So they played for a few years in the Pawcatuck Armory, but they had, I know there were a few seasons when they tried to secure the Armory to play, but I don't know because the records were kind of dicey at that time, I don't know if they ever officially played any games. I believe they did. Trying to see what I have, but yeah, I don't know if I found any actual records of games that they played there. The issue was in the school newspaper, they sometimes would have an athletics column, but then they'd also go months without having the athletics mentioned in there, so it's entirely possible that they were playing games then, and for some reason they didn't do a write-up of it. But I don't think I found any official mention of a game there. I know they tried to, but I don't know if they ever actually did.
You said that in the early 30s they were starting to play at the junior high.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just the boys, or the girls also playing there at the same time?
So I think the girls would have, so the girls played there, but if they were the interclass teams, when they just played against each other, similar to the Army-Navy teams that we're mentioning. So as far as I know, they played there because if they had a home court and, because it was in the school system, they would have had access to it. So I don't know for sure that was the case, but I imagine that they would have played there. Because if it was owned by the school system, and now they finally had a place that they could officially play. And that was only for, 6 years, I believe they played there, until they built the high school, and then everybody played there. But I imagine that would have been the case. Yes, sir?
I would go with the dark side across the we had a Relations cheerleading squad at that time because we only had intramural girls basketball. Cheerleaders were about 6 foot. But the rest of them were just fast and good athletes. We couldn't watch the girls play basketball. They put craft paper over the windows.
Really?
And they played.
I did not know
There were
that.
pictures in the yearbook.
Yeah.
We were allowed to even watch the game.
I did not know. Wow.
Do you know why?
Yeah. Yeah.
Still doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, see the coffee, please. Yeah.
It's true, though, they wouldn't allow, so what's the games for at that period of time? I don't know exactly when that is.
Yeah.
It did look that the pictures that Zach was showing of the early teens, some of the women were wearing what would have been pants or bloomers.
Yeah.
But there was one with pants, tight shorts, and those weren't allowed to be viewed. I mean, my mom was in college in the 50s, and they weren't allowed to wear pants on the weekends. They weren't allowed to wear pants and skirts, so it was very possible in those early teens because they weren't wearing.
Well, if you look at the evolution of bathing suits even, from a long time ago, women wore so
Sure.
stuff to uniforms that,
And what about the men's uniforms? They went from those little tiny shorts,
Mhm.
the Larry Bird shorts,
Yeah.
to the ones that come down below their knees.
Yeah.
And,
I didn't mention that, but that's why I included some of them with the shorts too, because yeah, you can tell like the picture progressively gets longer. Yeah, it's yeah.
That was Michael Jordan.
Yeah. And I feel like that's actually starting to come back. I went to a URI game a couple weeks ago, and I feel like they're actually starting to like move back up in the other direction now too. So.
Is there anything you're looking for from the audience and several players in terms of archive materials about these?
Oh.
Do you have any records
Goodness.
from the 1950s, from when you played?
Anything anyone is willing to give us, I'm always is my usual answer. But really,
Yeah.
I actually
Yeah.
stuck a couple of things in,
oh.
not knowing it.
Oh.
This is our archivist, so
Yes.
each man.
That would be great. We have some stuff here, but I wish we had more.
W does
so-
not have the bulldog
Oh.
or anything on it.
Yeah, that one is, that's actually from the cover of the yearbook from 1957. I just cropped that out. So yeah, it was a soft cover, and that's the image they used. I just like that one. I don't know if they ever did on the W, but yeah.
After that, I also have the article when I was
Oh.
heroine.
Oh,
Didn't spell my name correctly at all, but if you'd like to read that.
I mean, yes,
Yes, it
that's,
came out of the Westerly Sun,
Oh.
remember.
That's fantastic.
There is
So-
still misspelling.
Mhm. But yes, yes.
Just a short comment.
Mm-hmm.
In looking at the three areas that you pointed out in your report, you might call it, say, the Federico area,
Mm.
the Stella County area, and then today the Gleason area.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to bring out the fact that Coach Federico and I were blessed with perhaps the best talent that we possibly could get from boys that age. And I think of people like Stevie Pellegrino, Walter Gurley,
Mm-hmm.
Dave Stenhouse, and on, and Bobby Sarah, and on it goes. These are tremendous athletes. And so the quality of coaching, I would say, was very similar between Coach Federico and myself. And today, Coach Gleason, we see, is facing a whole change in the way the league is set up.
Mm.
So that the competition has changed somewhat from the days that we coached.
Yeah.
And the quality of coaching, as I've seen it today,
Mm-hmm.
is on a par, if not better, than it was during our years. And I think that needs to be brought out.
Oh, definitely.
And, there are a couple of just memories that I had that I'd like to share.
Of course, please.
We won the state championship in 1960, and at that game, we were 14 points down, and with 3 minutes to play. And we went after South Kingston on the full press, and to make a long story short, we caught up with them, and the score was 68-68 with about 2 seconds to play. So I was going to be the hero. I called a timeout, and I brought the boys over, and I set up a play for Ron Stenhouse, and he was going to get the screen and win the game for us. Well, as it turned out, the guy that put the ball in made a mistake, didn't give it to Ron, he threw it over to our sophomore, Roger Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
Ronnie didn't know what to do with the ball, so he threw it in and won the game for us.
I was gonna say, well, whatever he did, it worked. Yeah.
And we won the
Yeah.
championship. And I told him after the game, I said, Roger, you know, you were supposed to take that shot. But another game was up in Boston. I tell people that I'm proud of Westerly because Westerly was one of the teams that notified in terms of most points scored in the Boston Garden, you know, Boston Garden.
Oh,
And
I did not know that.
then I hope that they don't say, well, who won the game? We had played Wilbur Cross, they beat us 115-65.
Oh.
So we were part of the victory. Points for the judge. And just 2 other playing situations. We were playing Central Falls in a semifinal game, and again, it was a timeout situation late in the 3rd quarter, and I called a timeout and I set up a play, and it was supposed to be a half-court screen with my far weak side man running down the court. Well, as it happened again, the guy who took the ball out of the bounds made a mistake and threw the ball towards our own basket, which he was supposed to do. Maury Lamb, who was our guard, outran his defensive man and ran all the way down, caught up with the ball, scored 2 points, and scored a basket for us. After the game, the reporter said to me, the coach, he said, that was one hell of a play. I said, yeah, we practiced that. And the last one, we were playing Pawtucket West, and it went down to 7 seconds to play, and this is got Bobby verified. With 7 seconds left to play, and the kid from Protector West threw the ball in, Johnny Garofalo intercepted the ball, threw it to Bob Leibowitz, and he scored a basket, and the kid panicked, threw it back in, and Johnny Garofalo intercepted again, and scored another basket. We tied the score with about 4 seconds left to play. Protector West called the timeout. Billy Rutledge was the coach. He was beside himself. He called the timeout, and then when he threw the ball in, Leibowitz intercepts the pass. We ended up winning the ball game 4-0, by 4 points. And with only 7 seconds left to play, it was just unbelievable. But I do want to emphasize the fact that the coach today is facing a far more formidable challenge in terms of putting boys on the court and winning basketball games because of the setup that we're facing. And incidentally, they just won the other night playing Barnet, and I wish them well luck.
All right, well, if there aren't any more questions, I just want to say thank you, everyone, for being here, and appreciate it, and thank you so much. What?